Welcome to Raising Happy and Thriving Gifted Kids, a daily podcast where you get relatable stories, interesting lessons, and practical tips to help your kids thrive and be happy while enjoying your own life even more. I get these crazy assignments from time to time. So one of the assignments I now had was create a number of masterclasses for an international, huge, scale-up, part of a larger automotive company, and they're doing like really awesome, AI work and all kinds of stuff. And they were asking me to do a training on, neurodivergence for managers. So you're a manager of somebody who's very talented, but might also have limitations. Maybe a combination of a high IQ and, somewhere on the autism spectrum, or a high IQ and high on like the ADD spectrum. So how do you kind of work with these employees? And advice for the employees: what if you are one of these, people who have both a high talent and some kind of neurodivergent, like your brain is not average, it's not neurotypical approach. Like, how do you deal with that? And that kind of goes along. I don't know if you listened to yesterday's podcast, but the combination of like either swimming along the stream, where life will determine where you end up, or swimming upstream once in a while to actually, make it possible to get where you want to go in a better way. And this reminded me of a story or actually an interview I heard. Tim Ferriss, maybe you know him, he's done a lot of cool interviews. And one of his earlier interviews, he interviewed Walter O'Brien. And Walter O'Brien apparently was a really kid genius who, in Ireland somewhere, with the first, dial-up modems, hacked into NASA and downloaded the plans for the space shuttle. But like he ended up setting up several companies, and one of them, he actually was explaining his philosophy to hiring. He said, because most people hire, the most brilliant people I can find who still are decent team players and still can communicate kind of okay with the customers. He says, I take a different approach. My approach is that I will hire just the very best of the best. And they might not have social skills. They might not be able to function in a team. So that's why I hired my so-called super nannies, which are actually psychologists that guide these raw talents in interacting with the world. So that's a very interesting question. What do you do? Do you train yourself on the skill, if you're one of these talents, to add to your level of skills, your social abilities, your self-regulations or stuff like that? Or do you find a place that will just really take you as you are and compensate for all your weaknesses? But what you have to realize, and I don't know if Walter O'Brien did that in his company, but what you have to realize is that this is kind of like swimming along with the stream. You will have to limit your working options to the companies that are willing to organize a super nanny next to you. And at the very least, they'll kind of like deduct, if you look at your market value, they'll deduct the cost of a psychologist from your market value, because they'll actually have to pay that as a secondary benefit. So it will actually impact your ability to make money as well. So this is really, a trade-off that you have to look into. Will I find employers that will be flexible enough? And if I found an employer, will that employer employ me for the rest of my life? Or will I learn the skills? So, for instance, some people, learn the skills of entrepreneurship. They don't necessarily want to be an entrepreneur, but by learning the skill of entrepreneurship on top of their core talent, they create for themselves the freedom to use their talents in ways that are kind of like useful and that people will pay money for without being dependent on finding somebody. So for me, it all has to do with degrees of freedom and the amount of options you can keep open. And that's actually interesting, because I had a mentor once, Win Wenger, and he was talking about like a definition of intelligence being the person who can create, from any situations, the maximum amount of future options you can go towards, the maximum amount of freedom. Because the more freedom you have, the more choices you can make, the better choices you can make, as opposed to like limiting yourself along the way. So if you look at that, from that perspective to talent, development and yourself, like how can you maximize your future options? And one of them is by learning how to not only have your raw talent, but also learn how to interface with the rest of the world. And this is very valuable for your children as well. Teaching your children to have, to be able to go all out on their core strength, on their core, the thing that they're really good at, but at the same time teaching them the skills to kind of compensate for the weaknesses and be more broadly applicable, more broadly usable. Like they can interface with more parts of the world, so they have more choices. If there are like 5 universities that will actually cater to kids that are autistic, then that's awesome. But and that's not always the case, but if a kid is able to learn to become so high functioning that he doesn't need the adaptations for somebody who's on the autistic spectrum, then he can pick all the universities he wants. So there's more freedom. And he can still go to one of the universities that's focused on, compensating for the weaknesses if he or she wants to. So it's all about creating freedom in your life. At least that's what I believe.
If you liked this episode of Raising Happy and Thriving Kids, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast software. And if you want to dive deeply into all the things you can do to help your kids thrive, be happier while making your own life more enjoyable, go to smartparentingsecrets.com, where you can get free additional training. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, bring out the best in yourself and each other.